What do you do when your best soldier has 4 legs, can't understand a briefing, and has absolutely no idea why you're strapping him into a harness attached to a parachute? You train him anyway, because sometimes war demands the impossible, and dogs have been proving the impossible is just another day's work since humans first thought to bring them along to fight. The morning of June 6, 1944, Bing, a 2-year-old Alsatian with the British 13th Parachute Battalion, sat calmly in a specially designed canvas bag as his handler, Private Emile Cortet, checked the straps one final time around them. Hundreds of paratroopers prepared for the drop into Normandy. Men vomited from nervousness, others prayed. Some checked their weapons for the 10th time, hands shaking despite their training. Bing just looked at Cortet with the patient trust that only dogs can manage, waiting to see what strange thing his human wanted him to do next. In a few hours, Bing would become one of the first dogs to parachute into combat, dropping behind enemy lines with no understanding of what a parachute was, why he was falling through the sky, or what the D-Day invasion meant for the course of human history. He only knew that his handler was with him, and that was enough. The story of how dogs learned to parachute into battle is really a story about trust, about the extraordinary things animals will do simply because they believe in the humans they've bonded with, and about how military necessity pushed the boundaries of what anyone thought possible in the partnership between humans and dogs. Dogs have been part of warfare for thousands of years. Ancient armies used them as sentries and attackers. Medieval knights kept war dogs in armour. But the modern military working dog, the kind that could be trained for specialised tasks requiring intelligence and initiative rather than just aggression, emerged during World War I. In the trenches, dogs proved invaluable. They carried messages when radio communication failed and runners couldn't get through the artillery fire. They laid telephone wire across no man's land. They found wounded soldiers in the dark and stayed with them until medics arrived. German shepherds, in particular, showed an aptitude for this work that astonished their handlers. Sergeant Stubby, probably the most famous American war dog, served with the 102nd Infantry Regiment and participated in 17 battles. He learned to warn soldiers of incoming artillery shells and gas attacks before humans could detect them. He once caught a German soldier mapping Allied trenches and held him by the seat of his pants until American soldiers arrived. The dog couldn't understand the concept of espionage, but he understood that this stranger didn't belong, and that was enough. By World War II, every major military force had established formal war dog programs. The Germans, who'd pioneered military dog training before World War I, had the most sophisticated program. The British hastily expanded their program as war approached. The Americans, initially skeptical, established the War Dog program in 1942 after realizing how effective dogs could be. But all these programs focused on dogs working on the ground. Nobody had seriously considered making dogs jump out of airplanes. Why would they? It seemed absurd. Dogs don't understand height or gravity or parachutes. They can't pull their own ripcords. The whole concept appeared to violate every principle of animal psychology. Then airborne warfare changed everything. The German invasion of Crete in 1941, despite its high casualties, proved that paratroopers could seize strategic objectives before conventional forces arrived. The British and Americans rapidly expanded their airborne divisions, creating elite units that would drop behind enemy lines to disrupt communications, sabotage infrastructure, and prepare the way for larger invasions. These airborne units faced unique challenges. They dropped into enemy territory with limited supplies, no immediate support, and often unclear intelligence about enemy positions. They needed every advantage they could get. And someone, somewhere in British military planning, had a thought that seemed crazy enough to work. What if we could give paratroopers the advantages that dogs provided to ground infantry? Early warning of enemy approach, ability to detect ambushes, skills at finding wounded soldiers in difficult terrain, the psychological boost of having an animal companion in an extremely stressful situation. The only problem was getting the dogs out of the airplane. The British began experimenting with parachuting dogs in 1942, though the exact details remain somewhat obscure in military records. What's clear is that someone had to convince military leadership that this wasn't completely insane, then convince trainers to actually attempt it, and finally convince the dogs that jumping out of airplanes was a reasonable thing to do. The first challenge was mechanical. How do you attach a parachute to a dog? The animal's body shape is completely different from a human's. Dogs don't have shoulders that can support harness straps. They can't reach up to check their equipment. They can't signal if something is wrong. And unlike humans, who can adopt a stable falling position, dogs would tumble and spin, potentially tangling the parachute lines. The solution developed by British Quartermaster Corps was ingenious in its simplicity. Rather than trying to make dogs parachute like humans, they designed a canvas bag with a harness system. The dog would be placed in the bag with its legs through specially designed holes, comfortable but secure. The bag would attach to the handler's parachute harness, so dog and handler would descend together. This solved multiple problems simultaneously. The dog couldn't panic and injure itself during the fall. The handler maintained control. The dog's weight was properly distributed, and psychologically, being close to their handler would keep dogs calmer during the terrifying experience of falling through the sky. But solving the mechanical problem was the easy part. The real challenge was psychological. How do you train a dog to accept being put in a bag and dropped from an airplane? The training program developed at the British Airborne Forces Depot showed remarkable understanding of dog psychology. They couldn't explain to dogs what was happening or why they couldn't prepare them conceptually for the experience of freefall. What they could do was build trust so complete that dogs would accept even the most frightening experiences because they believed their handlers would keep them safe. The training started simply. Dogs were placed in the canvas bags on the ground while handlers gave them treats and praise. The bags were associated with positive experiences. Gradually, the bags were lifted slightly off the ground, then higher, then swung gently. Throughout this process, handlers maintained constant calm reassurance. Private Ken Bailey, who trained with the Parachute Regiment's war dogs, described the process in a post-war interview. The key was never rushing them. Some dogs took to it immediately, just accepted whatever strange thing we were doing. Others needed weeks of gradual exposure, but you couldn't force it. A terrified dog wouldn't be useful in combat, and more importantly, it wasn't fair to the animal. Once dogs accepted the bags, training progressed to simulated drops from static platforms, then from slow-moving trucks, building up their tolerance for the sensation of descent. The dogs that showed excessive fear or stress were removed from the program, not out of cruelty, but recognition that some animals simply couldn't adapt to this unnatural task. The actual parachute training began with ground training for the handlers. Paratroopers had to learn modified jumping techniques that accounted for the extra weight and different balance of carrying a dog. They practiced landing while protecting the canvas bag from impact. They drilled on quickly releasing dogs from the bags after landing, so the animals could immediately begin working. The first actual jumps were carefully staged. Dogs were given sedatives, not to knock them unconscious, but to reduce anxiety. Handlers jumped from lower altitudes than combat jumps, giving less time for dogs to panic. Multiple veterinarians waited at the landing zones to check each dog immediately after landing, and something remarkable happened. Most dogs handled it fine, not all of them certainly. Some dogs never accepted it despite weeks of training, but the majority of dogs, once they'd made 1 or 2 jumps and discovered they survived unharmed, seemed to simply accept that occasionally their handlers put them in bags and they fell through the sky for a while before returning to ground. It was strange, but no stranger than many other things humans asked them to do. Brian, a German shepherd who made over 20 combat jumps with British Airborne Forces, became something of a legend among paratroopers. His handler, Corporal Ken Ward, reported that by Brian's 5th jump, the dog would climb into the canvas bag on his own when he saw paratroopers preparing their equipment. The dog had learned to recognize the pre-jump routine and apparently decided that cooperation was easier than resistance. This highlights something crucial about dogs' relationship with humans. Dogs don't need to understand why, they just need to trust who. A dog doesn't comprehend military objectives or airborne tactics, but a well-trained military dog understands that his handler is part of his pack, and the pack does things together, even if those things involve falling out of airplanes. The psychological bond between military working dogs and their handlers is extraordinarily strong, often stronger than bonds between human soldiers handlers are with their dogs constantly during training and deployment. They feed them, exercise them, sleep near them, and work with them daily. The dog's entire world revolves around its handler. This creates a relationship where the dog will follow the handler into situations that would terrify a dog acting on instinct alone. Rob, a collie cross who served with the British 13th Parachute Battalion, made his first combat jump over Normandy on D-Day, alongside Bing Rob's handler, Corporal Ralph Henderson, later described watching other paratroopers' faces when they saw he was bringing a dog. They thought I was mad at first, but after we landed and Rob started working, finding wounded men in the dark, alerting us to German positions, those same men would share their rations with him. That dog probably saved a dozen lives that first night just by being exceptionally good at what dogs do, hearing and smelling things we couldn't. The Normandy jumps proved the concept worked in actual combat conditions. Bing, Rob, and several other dogs successfully parachuted behind enemy lines with their handlers. The drops weren't perfect. Bing's canvas bag split on landing, and he had to be calmed down after rolling through a hedge, but the dog survived and immediately began working. What's particularly remarkable is how quickly dogs transitioned from the trauma of the jump to performing their duties. Within minutes of landing, most dogs were alert and focused, helping their handlers navigate enemy territory. This adaptability speaks to dogs' remarkable ability to compartmentalize experiences. The jump was scary, but it's over now, and there's work to do. The work these parachuting dogs did varied based on their training. Some were patrol dogs, trained to alert handlers to enemy presence before an ambush could develop. Their keen hearing could detect movement hundreds of yards away. Their sense of smell could identify enemy soldiers by the different tobacco, soap, and food scents they carried. Other dogs were trained for casualty detection, finding wounded soldiers in areas too dangerous for medics to search thoroughly. A dog could cover terrain in darkness that would take human searchers hours, locating casualties by scent even if they were unconscious and couldn't call for help. Some dogs carried messages or medical supplies in saddlebags, running between separated units when radio communication failed, and some simply provided psychological support, offering stressed paratroopers a moment of normalcy when they could pet a dog and remember there was a world beyond the immediate danger. Glenn, a German shepherd who jumped with the 6th Airborne Division, became famous among his unit for a peculiar behaviour. After landing from jumps, he would systematically visit every soldier in his unit, letting each man pet him briefly before moving to the next. His handler, Private Thomas Walker, believed Glenn could sense the men's fear and was trying to comfort them. Whether this was true, or whether Glenn just enjoyed attention, the effect was real. Men facing combat reported feeling calmer after Glenn's visits. The Soviet Union developed their own parachuting dog program during World War II, but with a different approach. Rather than having dogs jump with handlers, Soviet trainers developed a semi-autonomous system where dogs were attached to specialized parachutes that would automatically deploy. The dogs were trained to stay still during descent, then immediately begin working upon landing. Soviet parachute dogs were primarily used for delivering supplies and medical equipment to partisan units behind German lines. The dogs would be parachuted near partisan camps with supplies attached to special harnesses. Once on the ground, the dogs would seek out human settlements, leading partisans back to the supply drop sites. This system required different training psychology. These dogs couldn't rely on their handlers during the jump. They had to be trained to tolerate the frightening experience alone, trusting that eventually they would reach ground and find humans. The training emphasized independence and confidence rather than the handler-bond approach of British and American programs. Sergeant Mikhail Kozyrev, who worked with the Soviet Airborne Dog program, described the challenge. We needed dogs brave enough to handle the jump alone, but social enough to immediately seek out humans after landing. Not every dog has that combination. The ones who did were remarkable animals. They'd land in unfamiliar forests, sometimes miles from where they were supposed to be, and still complete their mission. The German military, despite their sophisticated pre-war dog training programs, never developed a dedicated parachute dog program. This seems to have been a practical decision. Rather than a training limitation, German airborne operations were largely discontinued after the heavy losses in Crete, so there was little need for parachuting dogs. However, German records indicate they were aware of Allied parachute dogs and studied the concept. Several captured British training manuals on parachute dog procedures were found in German military archives after the war, suggesting they at least considered implementing similar programs. The American military was characteristically slower to adopt parachute dogs than the British, but once they committed, they approached it with typical American thoroughness. The US War Dog program established parachute training facilities at Fort Benning, Georgia, and Camp McCall, North Carolina. American trainers refined the British techniques, developing more sophisticated harness systems and more gradual training progressions. They also introduced psychological screening earlier in the training pipeline, identifying dogs unlikely to handle parachuting before significant resources were invested in their training. Sergeant Robert Landon, an American paratrooper who worked with war dogs in the Pacific, described the American approach. We tested dogs for everything: how they handled heights, loud noises, unexpected movements. We'd put them in situations similar to a jump without actually jumping, see how they responded. The dogs that stayed calm and focused, those were the ones we moved forward. We probably washed out more dogs than the British did, but the ones who made it through were absolutely reliable. The Pacific Theatre presented unique challenges for parachute dogs. The jungle terrain meant visibility after landing was severely limited, dogs could become separated from handlers easily in dense vegetation, and the tropical heat made the canvas bags uncomfortable for dogs during the plane ride before jumps. American forces adapted by developing lighter, more breathable bag designs, and by training dogs specifically for jungle navigation. Dogs learned to stay closer to handlers in dense terrain, and to respond to whistle commands that could penetrate jungle noise better than verbal orders. Chips, a German Shepherd Collie Husky mix who became one of America's most decorated war dogs, never made a parachute jump himself but trained with airborne units. His handler, Private John Rowell, noted that Chips showed no fear during training but became overexcited rather than calm. Chips wanted to do everything. He'd practically throw himself out of the airplane if we let him. But that enthusiasm meant he didn't focus on his job after landing. He was too busy being excited about the jump, so he ended up working with ground infantry instead, where he did incredible work. This highlights an important aspect of parachute dog selection. The ideal dog wasn't the most aggressive or the most obedient or the smartest. The ideal dog was the one who could experience something frightening, accept it as just part of the job, and immediately refocus on work. That's a rare combination of traits. The training also had to account for different dog breeds having different psychological needs. German Shepherds, bred for generations to work closely with handlers, generally adapted well to parachuting because they trusted their handlers so completely. Retrievers, bred to be independent problem solvers, sometimes struggled with the lack of control during descent. Terriers, bred to be stubborn and fearless, sometimes became overconfident and struggled to follow safety protocols. Captain James Frederick, a veterinarian assigned to the American Parachute Dog Program, wrote in his training notes, "We're not just teaching dogs to tolerate parachuting. We're teaching them to work effectively after experiencing significant trauma. That requires dogs with exceptional emotional resilience. It's not about intelligence or obedience, it's about psychological stability." The success rate of parachute dog operations was remarkably high considering the complexity. British military records indicate that over 80% of dogs who completed training successfully performed their duties after combat jumps. Injuries were rare, usually minor, and almost never directly caused by the parachute descent itself. Most injuries occurred during combat operations after landing, the same risks faced by all soldiers. What's particularly remarkable is that dogs who made multiple combat jumps showed decreasing stress responses with each jump. They were learning that the experience, while unpleasant, wasn't dangerous. This is counter to what happens with human paratroopers, who often report increasing anxiety with more jumps as they become more aware of what can go wrong. Dogs, lacking the human capacity to imagine disaster scenarios, simply learned that we get in the bag, we fall, we land, we work. Without the burden of imagination, they could accept the experience at face value. Rip, a mixed-breed dog who made 17 combat jumps with British forces, became a case study in canine adaptation. His handler, Lieutenant David Watts, kept detailed notes on Rip's behaviour before, during and after each jump. The notes show Rip's stress indicators, measured by panting, restlessness and heart rate, decreased significantly after the first 5 jumps, then plateaued. By his 10th jump, Rip showed no more stress than he did before routine ground patrols. The post-war period saw military interest in parachute dogs decline sharply. The nature of warfare was changing. Helicopters began replacing parachute drops. For inserting special forces, radio communication improved, reducing the need for messenger dogs, and the rise of electronic sensors and surveillance technology meant that some jobs traditionally done by dogs could now be done by machines. But the parachute dog programs left important legacies. They demonstrated that dogs could be trained for far more complex tasks than previously believed. They proved that the human-dog bond was strong enough to overcome even the most unnatural experiences. And they established training methodologies that would influence all future military and civilian working dog programs. Modern military working dogs still occasionally parachute, though now it's usually with special forces in counter-terrorism operations. The techniques have evolved. Specialized harnesses replace canvas bags, and dogs now wear protective goggles called doggles to prevent eye injuries from wind and debris during descent. Some dogs even have their own parachutes controlled by handlers via remote release systems. But the fundamental principle remains the same. You build trust so complete that the dog will follow you anywhere, even out of an airplane at 12,000 feet. Mike Forsyth, a Navy SEAL who has worked with multiple military working dogs, including several trained for parachute operations, described the modern approach. We're standing on the shoulders of those World War II handlers who figured this out. The technology has changed, but the relationship hasn't. My dog doesn't understand why we jump out of airplanes any more than those dogs in Normandy did. He just knows that where I go he goes, that trust is everything. The dogs themselves, of course, never knew they were pioneering anything. Bing didn't understand he was among the first dogs to parachute into combat. Rob didn't know his successful D-Day jump would prove a concept military planners had debated. Brian couldn't comprehend that his willingness to climb into the canvas bag without resistance demonstrated something profound about the human-animal bond. They were just dogs, doing what dogs have done since humans first invited them into our lives thousands of years ago. They followed where we led, they trusted when we asked them to trust. They worked alongside us even when the work was dangerous and the situation was terrifying. The remarkable thing about parachute dogs isn't that humans figured out how to make dogs jump from airplanes. Humans are pretty good at solving mechanical and training problems when military necessity demands it. The remarkable thing is that dogs were willing to do it at all. That a dog's trust in its handler was so complete, so unshakable, that even being put in a bag and thrown out of an airplane at 3,000 feet couldn't break it. That minutes after experiencing one of the most unnatural and frightening situations imaginable for an animal, these dogs would calmly go about their work, alerting to danger, finding wounded soldiers, carrying messages through enemy fire. Private Ken Bailey, the British trainer who worked with early parachute dogs, reflected on this in a 1987 interview, decades after the war. People always asked me how we got dogs to jump out of airplanes. The answer is we didn't really. We got dogs to trust us so completely that they'd do anything we asked, and then we asked them to jump out of airplanes. The jumping was the easy part. Building that kind of trust, that's the hard part. That's what made it possible. When Private Emile Cortet landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, one of his first actions was releasing Bing from the canvas bag. The dog shook himself, looked around at the chaotic scene of a nighttime combat drop, looked back at Cortet as if to say, well, that was weird, and then immediately began working, nose to the ground, ears alert, doing what German shepherds had been bred for centuries to do, working alongside their human partners. Years later, Cortet would tell his grandchildren about the war. He'd describe the fear, the confusion, the horror of combat. But when he talked about Bing, his voice would soften. That dog trusted me enough to jump out of an airplane with me in the middle of the night into enemy territory. I spent the rest of my life trying to be worthy of that trust. The canvas bags and static line parachutes are museum pieces now. The techniques have evolved, the technology has advanced, but the fundamental truth discovered by those early parachute dog trainers remains unchanged. A dog doesn't need to understand why you're asking them to do something impossible. They just need to believe that you'd never ask them to do something that would harm them. That belief, that absolute trust, can convince a dog to do things that seem to violate every instinct they possess. Dogs learn to parachute into battle the same way they learn to search rubble for survivors after earthquakes, or detect cancer in medical patients, or guide blind people through city streets, or do any of the thousands of jobs we've asked them to perform throughout history. They learned because they trusted us. And they trusted us because somewhere, thousands of years ago, humans and dogs made a deal. We'd take care of them, and they'd work with us, and dogs have been honouring that deal ever since, even when honouring it means jumping out of perfectly good airplanes. The scratch of paws on metal aircraft floors, the rustle of canvas bags, the snap of parachutes deploying in darkness, the soft thud of paws hitting earth after a controlled descent. The sound of dogs proving once again that they really are man's best friend, even at 3,000 feet and falling.